Let's talk about budgeting this afternoon or this evening. I want to talk with you about what budgeting is. I think there's some misconceptions about what it is. Some fear that comes along with those misconceptions. Why do it? And then what folks should probably know as they begin to become active or become aware of the budgeting process. Okay, let's start with what it is. This is a definition that comes from classic text on public budgeting by Lynch. And you see that he defines budgeting as a plan for the accomplishment of programs that are related to objectives and goals within a definite time period, including an estimate of the resources required, together with an estimate of resources available, and usually compared with one or more past periods and showing future requirements. Now, the things that I've already handed out to you won't meet that test. This is a budget document, and in the shorthand of an agency, we talk about this as the budget. But in reality, a budget constitutes something far more comprehensive than this. Something that involves a lot more reading and a lot more effort than what simply goes into that particular document that's before you. And that, as you'll see, will also continue past the life, the budget year or fiscal year for which this particular budget or any particular budget is operative. Notice that the budget is a plan here in this definition. And one of the things we're going to see is that in relatively recent times, there's been an effort to marry the formal planning processes, particularly within government agencies, with budgeting. Because as we said before, and it's a legacy that comes down from hundreds of years, is whoever does control the purse strings controls the plan, controls the programming ultimately. And so back in the 1960s especially, there was a very deliberate effort to marry planning and budgeting together, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. When we're talking about budgeting, it's important to distinguish among concepts of budgeting, particularly as a plan, and as a political process. As a political process. Do you remember my mentioning the name David Gill to you earlier in the semester? And Gill defined social policy as the logic by which we understand the distribution of rights, statuses, and resources within a society. Now, when we're talking about budgeting, we're very much talking about the distribution of money, a very important resource across agencies or across programs or across people and in service of particular programs with particular goals and objectives. Very much a distribution of resources. Well, distribution of resources is one of the defining characteristics of policy. Then a budget represents a kind of a policy document or a policy decision. And the process of budgeting, therefore, also a political process itself. By the way, what do you know about politics? Is it always nice and clean and rational and sequential? No, it's not at all, right? And neither is budgeting. It's important to distinguish between budgeting and bookkeeping. Yes, both involve money. Sometimes lots and lots of money. And the budgeting process and the budgeting skills do require, at some points, a clear accounting of the money that's to be appropriated for certain usage, how it's spent, when it's spent, what it's spent for. That's where bookkeeping comes in. Now, bookkeeping is different from accounting. Anybody here ever majored in accounting or started to major in accounting as an undergraduate?
I've had some accounting classes.
Okay. what's interesting is I've known a number of people who are accountants and studied accountancy, and many of them will talk about a particular class in their college career where a professor will say, this is the class that will help you understand whether you like bookkeeping or accountancy. And with accountancy, then, there's a lot of things about projecting costs and projecting losses and projecting revenue streams and tax law and things like that, all right? Now, that's important, but that's not necessarily the budgeting processes we're going to be talking about it here. It is related to money. Some of the same kind of imperatives or goals that you're going to see that are built into the budgeting process might be expressed in either bookkeeping or accountancy. But here's the nice thing. You don't have to be an accountant to be good at budgeting. You don't have to be an accountant or a bookkeeper to learn the skills, particularly the political skills, or the writing skills, or the presentation skills that are critical to budgeting. Oh, one other thing while I'm saying something like this. I've handed you two budgets, right? And if you look particularly at the one for the public library, which is the line item budget, pretend that you're on the board of directors for this particular library. You're a new member of the board of directors. This is the first time you've seen this budget document. Chances are, even as you look at this, you have no idea of what's going on in that library other than the fact that they have books and magazines and occasionally loan them. This document doesn't really tell you much in isolation. And it would be very easy for you looking at this document as a new board member, and particularly listening to experienced board members talk authoritatively and with insight into what they're gleaning from this document. It'd be very easy to think that you're a moron. Right? Holy cow, you know, I can't read this at all. I have no idea what's going on. And guess what? That's the first set of impressions that you're likely to get when you're confronted with a new budget. Because every organization kind of structures their budget in ways that make sense to people who've been with that organization for a while, generally. It takes a while to learn what that logic is. It takes a while to learn what those numbers mean, how they compare to past numbers, how they compare to projections for this year, how they compare to a plan for next year and the year beyond. And chances are, as a new board member, you don't have that knowledge. So I'm saying this to you so that when that happens to you, right, just take note. Oh, it's happened to me. This is the beginning step of becoming familiar with a document. And the people around me who seem to be these budget experts, guess what? Several years ago, they started out right where I'm feeling right now as well. That's the natural way of things. Now, a budget focuses on a fiscal year. It focuses on a calendar year. Well, excuse me, it focuses on a 12-month period of time is what I'm trying to say. And generally, that fiscal year is not the calendar year. It's not the year 2012, for example. July may be a time when the calendar or the fiscal year starts. It does here in the state of Tennessee, for example. Here at ETSU, we'll move into a new fiscal year, a new budget year on July 1. And by the way, at ETSU, what that means as a budget manager is that most of the money I have available to me as a budget manager disappears on June 30th, no matter how much we've saved, and we start again with the new budget that's been appropriated or allocated to us on the very next day.
And it doesn't roll.
Some things do, but very few things do, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. That's exactly right. I mean, by rolling, what that means is that a certain sum will move over and still remain available to you in the new year, perhaps not having been spent in the past year. Some money may roll over only for 1 year, for example, and then if you don't spend it, you lose it. As a budget manager at ETSU and the academic side of the house, most of the money that we have available to us, actually we lose at the end of the fiscal year, and then we begin to operate with, in effect, new money as appropriated on the following day, on June 1st. Now, a budget year might start, the fiscal year might start on October 1, for example. So different entities are not governed by any particular universal law that makes consistent the beginning and ending points of fiscal years. Yes?
I was just curious why they choose the month that they choose.
You know, I don't know.
Because
I think that's
especially
exactly.
rolling, I mean, because like we start in July, and
Mhm.
that's just, but it's like you think so with the new calendar year starting, it just always seems odd to me. I didn't know if there were certain reasons to that.
The only thing I can think of has to do with the revenue side of the house and with the taxes and when taxes are due. And April 15th generally now would be a period of time when people would be paying have to be paying their taxes, so that government could have some idea of what their tax revenue might be, at least for a 12-month period of time. If people aren't submitting it quarterly, let's say, you might have a better idea of what the amount of money is going to be available to them. The interesting thing, though, about public budgeting, there's some differences between public budgeting and private sector budgeting, but with budgeting, the emphasis has been primarily on expenditures and not on revenue generation. So what I've just mentioned is actually something of a relatively minor consideration many times in the budgeting process, and particularly at the federal level, because the feds can go into the red, as we all know, and operate government at a deficit, as we've been doing for years and years and years. States and municipalities are not legally able to do that, and one runs certain kind of risks if you do that in the private sector. Okay. Now notice that while the execution of the budget or the administration of the budget, as might be represented by this particular budget document here, takes place within a 12-month period of time, the fiscal year, the budget year, the actual preparation of the budget precedes that, and maybe precedes it by several years. And then after the budget year is over, there'll be an evaluation. There'll also be an accounting that takes place, and that will follow that particular budget year. So we might think of the actual budget year, that fiscal year of 12 months, as being surrounded on both sides, the beginning and the end, by quite a few additional months of work that takes place. And this is a continuing process, so that people who are active in public budgeting especially are always at work. And again, even at this point, I want to emphasize to you that budgets represent proposed plans. So why do we do it? There are a variety of reasons why budgeting is a central feature of the organizational landscape. Among these, there's the effort to balance means with expenditures. And as an aside here, cutting the budget to where it's manageable becomes a very important and frequently very public part of a public budgeting or a governmental budgeting process. But even in the private sector, cutting the budget so that it's manageable given either expected revenues or what turns out to be eventual revenues becomes a very important thing. If done during the preliminary budgeting process, it tends to be somewhat more public, somewhat more formalized. But even during the budget year itself, there may be certain kind of revenue shortfalls that occur, or there may be certain kind of emergencies that arise, or certain kind of problems that arise that require monies to be reallocated across categories or across items based upon the level of freedom that budget actors have. Cutting in a public process where people have voice and where responsibility for decision making is either shared or diffused can become very important for certain actors, particularly elected actors, to avoid many of the negative consequences of telling people, no, we're not going to be funding your program, or we're not going to be funding it to the level that you wish. Oh, and the reason why is because I don't have the support to do that with you. These other people have had their say. They're demanding some level of the money that we have. Budgeting is also important as a way of holding people and organizations accountable. And if you think back to the definition that Lynch offered us, where the budget represents a plan to commit resources to particular programs with particular goals and objectives, then you can see how individuals and organizations can be held accountable, not only for how they spend the money, but for what they achieve with the money that's being spent. There's an effort here through budgeting to control for overspending. It'd be so easy for individuals without the constraints of a budget to commit resources that they don't have to one program after another. Budgeting is a method of expressing organizational or government policy. It is itself a policy document. So beyond the rhetoric, look at the money. Where's the money going? Into what programs is the money going? That's as close to an operational definition of the priorities of a government or of an organization as you can get. Far clearer, far more truthful than rhetoric. Budgeting is used to evaluate, or as part of an evaluation process for programs. We'll talk about some of the ways those evaluations are conducted. Budgeting represents a good public relations tool. A good budget, a budget that looks good, public hearings, the appearance of voice, the appearance of people listening can be very important to helping to legitimate the decisions that folks make as to how much money will be spent and for what. Budgeting is an exercise, or can be an exercise, in good personnel management, as one looks at the outcomes, the products that particular managers are able to achieve with the resources that they're given, particularly as compared against the promises or the goals and objectives that such individuals are associated with. And again, a budget is a plan. So what should you know about this stuff? Well, there are a number of major approaches to budgeting. Some emphasize control. The line item budget, more than anything else, addresses control. The line item budget, given its logic, is an effort to eliminate or reduce or identify theft, embezzlement, misappropriation of funds. That's why when you look at this library budget here, or all these line items here, it really doesn't tell you much about what the library does. It really doesn't tell you much about what the library's priorities are, or programs at all. But if you have this budget in hand, and then you have the ledger, the double entry ledger of the bookkeeper, that's showing what money was spent and for what item, and this is the receipt, or oh, guess what? We don't have a receipt for that $10,000. Here's an item that says leather couch, and there's no leather couch. Right? The line item budget is a document that clearly indicates how and only how a certain amount of money was to be spent. And so that's part of the value of the line item budget. Of course, we've already identified some of the major weaknesses of it. That is to say, it's very, very difficult to get a sense of what programming is or what priorities are or what the level of performance is within the entity by looking only at a line item budget. Management. Management is an important agenda for some approaches to budgeting. And we'll talk a little bit about a thing called a performance budget. And a performance budget is very, very much reflective of this important goal of improving management. Because the key with the performance-oriented budget is the resources, the nature, amount of resources that go into particular programs and what's achieved by the use of those particular resources. And then politics. Politics is a very important agenda, particularly in the public budgeting arena. Again, politics involves the art, the science, and the techniques of making key decisions about how resources are going to be spent. Knowing that you don't have enough resources to go around for every good idea. Oh yeah, and nobody can really agree universally what a good idea is anyway, because there's no one community of thought. What else should you know about this, according to Mike Smith? Well, budgeting is specialized. There are people who have particular sets of skills, particular responsibilities to engage in particular ways throughout the budgeting process and also at particular stages of the budgeting process. Budgeting is historical. What do you think that means? It actually means several things, a number of which are all going to be true.
Well, you said that in a fiscal year there's months or years on this side of it and on this side of it. So that creates an historical line. Okay,
that's right. That's correct. All right. What's another way that one might think of budgeting as historical?
Well, mistakes can repeat themselves.
That's exactly right. It's like the timeline, the lifeline for a bad idea just never seems to kind of run out. Yeah, that's exactly right. What's another way that budgeting can be historical?
Develop your budget based on past expenditures.
That's exactly right. It would be a mistake to think that people start anew when they go to construct a budget. That the budget from last year is a document that people who are going to be creating the next year's budget have access to. They're going to look at the amount of money that was available to them then, how it was spent, what it was spent for, and the what it was spent for is largely going to be in things that are called sunk costs. They're going to be programs and initiatives and people that are still with us, that are still open on the books, if you will, that have not yet achieved the kind of terminal goals that were intended for them. And yet promises have been made. People hired, investments made. Now, is a budget actor going to walk away from that the following year? Rarely will they do that kind of thing. So the decisions of yesterday involve profound legacies in terms and constraints in terms of how we write and what we write into the budget for the next year. Said somewhat differently, the best bet on what next year's budget is going to look like is generally what? This year's budget. Yeah, that's right. And we're going to see that there's an approach to budgeting that's referred to as the incremental approach to budgeting, right? Which is to say that one generally avoids radical changes in amounts or direction of budgets from year to year, and you rather play with the margins. You adjust slightly up, you adjust slightly down for the next year, get a sense of how that works. What are the political realities, the political support, political fallout of those marginal decisions? And then if you've made a mistake anywhere, you've got next year's budget where you can make a decision to either continue to push forward, even against the push back, or if you will regard the resistance as significant enough that you alter your budget decisions to reflect the level of unrest or of dissonance that it caused. Budgeting is fragmented. Now, when it comes down to it, in any large organization, particularly in public budgeting as well, that the decisions that are made at different parts of the budget are generally made in isolation of the programmatic nature of other initiatives, which is to say that if you're going to increase funding for child welfare, chances are you're doing it without reference to the amount of money that's going to be spent on juvenile justice, which is those decisions about the budget are being made without respect to the amount of money that's going to be going into public housing. That the budgeting tends to be driven by certain kind of programmatic parameters, and there's an internal political logic as to whether or not the budget amounts will go up or go down. Now, in the end, you add these things together. You add the amount of money for community mental health to the number of dollars that you're seeking for drug abuse and prevention, to the amount of money that you want for housing, to the amount of money you want for daycare services, etc. And in the end, that constitutes the budget. But it's fragmented, isn't it? So much of the time, then, the budget is really treated as a non-programmatic document or decision. The relationship of one program to another, the needs of a program to establish momentum, to profit from momentum that it's had, to profit from the learning curve, may be lost in the politics of budgeting, and may be lost when one butts up against real life financial constraints. Budgeting is repetitive. Every year or every 2 years, you're going to be repeating the same kind of things that you had done before. And again, chances are the programs that you're working with, the heart of your major programs, they're continuing. And it's sequential. One set of activities following the other through a particular budget cycle that might last 1 year, that might last 2, or as we've talked about, maybe as long as 5. We'll take a pause now, take a break, come back, we'll continue.